So it's now time to kind of put everything we learned so far together to create a scene. But before doing that, let me show you one of the problems that you might run into when importing an FBX file into Motion Builder and how you can solve that problem. So if you go to our folder for this exercise, adding scene elements, there's a subfolder called Old Building, and I'm going to use this FBX file, which is basically an old building. And by default, the model is quite big for my scene, so I'm going to zoom out to see the whole building. But this is another problem that you might run into, that if you zoom out so much to a point, what happens is you start losing the ability to see the whole building, as you see around here. Okay, so eventually you don't see the model at all. So the cameras then inside of Motion Builder are not like human eyes, because as you might know, human eyes are unlimited in terms of how far you can see. So for example, we can see stars which are actually thousands and thousands of light years away, but we can still see them. But it's not like that in Motion Builder. But the good news is you can adjust how far or how close the camera can actually see in Motion Builder. So right now I am in producer perspective, so I'm going to go to that camera. I'm going to double click on producer perspective, and here we have near plane and far plane. Okay, so we need to increase this value here, which is just an arbitrary number. But if you increase that value, as you see, you start seeing the full model. If you decrease it, you don't see the model. Okay, so this is how you can solve that problem. So I'm going to make it a big number. Okay, and the other thing that I realize here is that the object is way too big, so we need to actually size it down. So I'm going to go to my schematic view by pressing Ctrl W, select all the objects that make up for the building, go back to the producer perspective camera and use my scale tool, and let me see where my little gizmo is, which is right here. Okay, so I'm gonna make it way smaller. Okay, and I'm gonna bring it down because right now it's floating in the air. Okay, so I need to bring it more closer to the grid and still make it a bit smaller. There we go. And come here again. Sorry, I lost my selection. Okay, let's zoom in. I'm trying to place the object in the middle of my grid area. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do here is to make sure that the building actually sits on the floor or on the ground. So I'm going to use my producer front camera. Okay, and as you see, this is my ground level. So I'm going to zoom out, and this is where my building is. So it's way above. So I'm going to bring it closer. And again to the center. Let's zoom in to make sure that the building sits right on top of the ground. Perfect. Okay, go back to the producer perspective, move it back a bit, and I think, there we go, I think this is a good location for my building. Okay, so going back to the original problem with this FBX file, which is the fact that we don't see the texture. When I downloaded this file from the internet, it had a very nice texture, but right now all I see is these question marks. The interesting thing was that when I downloaded the FBX model, it came in a folder with a bunch of texture files, which are actually hidden right here. As you see, these are all the texture files. So in fact, we do have the texture files, but we don't see them here. So to fix that problem, what we need to do is come down here to the textures area. Okay, and these are the textures that this model uses. So if you go to the first one and open that plus sign and just double click on this item here, this is the path that the computer is trying to find the texture file that is needed for that piece. So apparently this is not where my texture file is. So I need to tell Motion Builder where actually my texture file is. So I'm gonna click on Browse, and in my case it's gonna be on my desktop. I'm gonna go to Adding Scene Elements, Alt Building. So they are. So the name of the file is WA01SL01. Let me go to this view here to make it a bit easier. Okay, this is it. So I'm gonna click on Open. And now Motion Builder is actually kind of smart in knowing that in that folder that I specified, there are other texture files. So it's asking me, do you want to load other missing files as well? And I say yes. Okay, so now all these different textures are automatically located by Motion Builder. So now when you zoom in to the building, okay, you see this very nice texture that make up for the building. So this is one of the problems that you might run into when downloading FBX files into Motion Builder. So this is how you can fix that problem. Now let's look at how we can bring everything together to create a nice scene. So for that reason, I'm gonna go to my village folder, and I'm gonna use this FBX file that says Fontarial v3. So I'm gonna drag and drop this one onto my scene, no animation. And as you see, this model comes with the texture intact, so no problem with that. But again, this is a big model for my scene, so I'm gonna make it smaller. I'm gonna zoom out first of all to see the whole thing. Okay, so this is the model, and again I'm running into the same problem with my camera, so I'm gonna go to the producer perspective camera, double click, and increase my value for the far plane. Okay, so I need to make this model smaller, so I'm gonna go to my schematic view, press F to see everything, or it's right there. Okay, so in this case it's a bit different than the previous model because it doesn't have multiple pieces that make up for the whole model. It's just one piece all grouped into a single object. Okay, so I'm gonna select that, go back to my producer perspective view, use my scaling tool by pressing S and scale it down. Okay, so I'm gonna zoom in again, and there we go. It's kind of nice. Okay, so I'm gonna try to position this somewhere in the center of the grid. Okay, that's good enough. And I'm gonna again go to my front view, which is here, just to make sure that the building actually sits on the floor. And this one looks like it's definitely sitting on the ground level. So there's nothing that we need to do here. Go back to the producer perspective view. Let me take this out. So what I want to do here is I want to add my character to the scene. For the sake of convenience, I'm going to use the Aragorn character that comes with Motion Builder. And since I'm going to add this character to the scene, I'm gonna use FBX merge and no animation because I'm gonna add my animation later on. Okay, so my character now is a bit bigger than the other buildings, so we're gonna have to resize him to match with the size of the buildings. So I'm gonna go to Aragorn root, press S for scale, or you can just click on here and bring him down. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna try to adjust his size, but let me give you guys a tip when resizing characters compared to the buildings around him. And if you have doors, just like we have it here in our scene, it's actually a bit easier because you can resize the character based on the door, so he should be able to fit through that door. So I'm gonna zoom in more to see him here. So I'm gonna go like that. Okay, so I'm gonna take this and see if we can actually fit through that door. I think it's a bit too big, so I'm gonna make it just a tad smaller. There we go. Okay, so I think this is a pretty good size for the character in relation to the environment. I'm gonna put him somewhere here. Okay. The next thing I'm gonna do is add motion. So I'm gonna go to my folder again. Okay. So I have this mail to walk file, which is an FBX motion file. So I'm just gonna apply this to my character. And since it's an FBX file, I can use my story editor, and I can just drag this and drop it onto my timeline here. And since I only have one character in the scene, it automatically detects that character and applies the motion to that character. So I'm gonna bring it to the frame 0, and I'm gonna use my ghosting option here to bring him outside. There we go. Okay, and you can actually, using the rotation tool, change the direction of his walk as well. Okay, so I want something like that. So when you press play, we have the character that walks in front of a building. Another thing that is missing in this scene is the floor. There's no floor here. So what we need to do then is to add a floor, of course. To do that, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to my templates, elements, open up the elements, and go to primitives. And I'm gonna use a plane. Okay, so I'm gonna add this plane onto the floor. Okay, and as you see right now, the plane is not actually sitting on the ground, so I'm gonna use my producer front view to bring it down to the ground level. Okay, and again, don't be afraid to zoom in real close to really nail this down. Okay, so this is pretty good, and I think Aragorn is a bit going through the floor, so I'm gonna fix that as well. I'm gonna bring him just a bit above. There we go. Okay, and go back to the producer perspective. Now I'm gonna place this. Sorry, I'm gonna place the floor element somewhere here, so it covers the whole area that I want. Now my camera is going to be somewhere here, looking toward the character, so I don't need to cover the whole floor. You just need to cover up the places where the camera actually sees. Okay, so I have the floor now, but of course there's no texture on it. So what I did was I went on to the internet and searched for a texture for a pathway with some stones to kind of match it with the buildings here. So if I go to the folder here, it's this one right there. Okay, so all you need to do now to attach that texture on to this plane is just to drag and drop it on top of the floor. Okay, so that's what we get. Now, of course, the size of the tiles here are way too big in relation to the character and the environment, so we can actually fix that. And what I'm gonna do is, this is my material, and it's right there. If you double click on it, we get this dialog box here, and here we have the option for scaling. So if I bring this to maybe 5, and this one 5 as well, it makes it a lot smaller. So let's zoom in and see if it's big enough or small enough. And yes, it's not bad. So for now I think we can keep it at 5. Alright, so now we have a character with motion, we have a background scenery, which is the building here, and we have a floor. And I think the only thing we are missing now in terms of the objects in our scene is the sky. There is no sky, and since the camera is going to be placed somewhere here, we should be able to see the sky. So we're going to add a sky element in our scene as well. To do that, what you need to do is to go to the elements, again primitives, and this time bring in a sphere. Okay, so this is my sphere. So what I'm gonna do is actually using my scaling tool, I'm gonna make it huge to a point where it looks like a sky in the background. Okay, so I think this is good enough. And of course it doesn't have any texture on it now. And again, I went to the internet and downloaded a texture for the sky, and this is how it looks like. So again, to attach this texture onto the sphere, all you need to do is to drag and drop this on to that object and attach texture to material, diffuse. It's right there, and now it looks kind of black, as you see. Okay, we do see some stuff here, but it's kind of black. What you can do is you can use the emissive tool here to bring the colors, to make the colors brighter. Okay, so I can see it now here, and of course this little swirly element, whatever that is, looks too futuristic and unrealistic for this kind of scene. So we need to use a different part of the sky for this scene. Well, there we go. Okay, so I'm gonna try to find a spot where it looks nice, and I think this is not a bad spot. Okay, so now we have a sky as well in our scene. So at this point, in terms of the elements that we need to add into our scene, is complete. So next thing we need to do is to add our camera. So let's add a camera. And if you remember, to do that you have to go to the elements and add a camera right here. Okay, so let me zoom out a bit here so we can see where the camera is and where it's looking at. Okay, so the camera is here and it's looking at this direction, which is completely opposite direction that we need. So never forget, before you do anything, just rename your cameras in case you want to use multiple cameras. So this is going to be my camera A, and this is going to be my camera A interest. Camera A interest. Okay, so I'm gonna take this camera interest object and move it toward this direction. Let me zoom in here. Okay, so it's gonna look somewhere there. Okay, so now I'm gonna go to my camera. In other words, I'm gonna look through the camera. So I'm gonna use my camera A to position my camera. There we go. So if it comes this way, let me zoom in a bit more. And I don't want to see these circles around the character, so I'm going to go to display, models only, so we don't see any unnecessary objects. Okay, so I think this is a pretty good angle, but since this is going to be my final camera that I will actually render out, I need to specify the exact dimensions for my scene. So to do that, you need to go, after double clicking on the camera, you need to go to the resolution, select fixed resolution, and if you remember, we're gonna use full HD resolution, which is 1920 by 1080. Okay, so now we can actually locate our camera in its final position. Right, so you can try to find your best spot. Let's say something like that. You can always change it later on. Okay, now whatever you see here in this scene will actually render out as a movie file, including this little 3D gizmo and the lines on the floor. Okay, so of course we don't want to see these lines and the gizmos here or anything else. So what we need to do is to come to this section and take everything out. We don't want to see anything but the scene elements in our scene. Now that that is done, what I want to do is to make the look of the scene a bit more natural. So if I go to render options, and I'm gonna click on enable real-time effects, okay, and this is the option that I want to focus on now. Let me zoom here. If you look at these curvy edges here, you will see that the edges are kind of jagged, they're not smooth. If you remember from Photoshop, you can use the anti-aliasing option to make the curvy lines or edges smoother. So you can actually use the same technique or the same feature here in Motion Builder. So I'm gonna come here and check this use anti-aliasing option. And as you see, immediately the overall look of the scene looks much more smoother, which adds more realism to the scene. Okay, now the next thing I'm gonna do is to add depth of field in my scene to make it even more natural. So since the character is very close to the camera and then we have elements in the background, we should be able to use the depth of field. So I'm gonna click on that. Okay, now the first problem here of course is the focus angle. This value here is way too much, so you can use a value like 0.5. okay, now here the focus distance is set to camera interest. You can change that to a specific distance and then adjust that distance here. Okay, there we go. But I think our focus angle value is still too much, so I'm going to bring it down to maybe 0.2. okay, I still think it's a bit too much, so maybe 0.1. There we go. I think this is pretty good. Okay, so without depth of field, with depth of field. So it adds a better sense of depth in our scene. So here we selected specific distance for our focus distance. You can use this method, or you can select the focus model. What this allows us to do is to select an object in the scene, and wherever that object is, the camera will continuously focus on that spot. So in this case, I think we can use the character's head to focus on. So I'm going to go to Aragorn, and we have Aragorn head. Okay, so I can take this and place it right here where it says focus model. Okay, so here's a focus model option as well selected. The camera is not going to take into consideration of this specific distance value. It's just going to focus on wherever the head is. So if I zoom out a bit, there we go. As you see, the head is in focus. And after a certain distance, when the character gets too close to the camera, it can't focus anymore because the character is too close. It just moves away. Okay, or maybe we can move the camera a bit to the right, so the character moves off screen. Okay, there we go. Okay, so that's how you can lock your focus on a character in your scene by using focus distance source as focus model. Okay, next what we can do is to add a light source to our scene. So just like adding a camera in your scene, you can find the lights under elements, and here is our light. So I'm gonna add a light here, and to adjust the position of my light, I'm gonna jump out of my camera and go to my producer perspective. Okay, so this is where my light is. Okay, let's bring this up a bit. Now you can actually change the type of the light from here. So you can use point light, infinite light, spotlight, or area light. In this case, I'm going to use a point light, which is basically like a light bulb that illuminates everything around it. 360 degrees. You can change the color of the light by using the RGB values here. Okay, so I'm gonna make them 1 and 1 and 1 to make a perfect white color. Okay, again, maybe you can use a bit of greenish color here to go with the overall feeling of the scene, which I kind of like this one. And I want to make sure that the cast light on object and cast shadows options are selected, because I do want shadow of the character, because whenever there is light there's also shadow. Okay, so the problem here is that I still don't see any shadows. So where is the shadow? Well, what you need to do for that is, for example, I want this floor to cast the shadow, so I select the floor element. I'm gonna go to shading elements, open that up, and shaders, and there is one element here that says live shadow. Okay, so I'm gonna apply this on to the floor. All right, and I'm gonna select the append option, and as you see, immediately we start seeing the shadow. And when I select the light, and if I change the location of the light, as you see, the place of the shadow changes accordingly. Okay, so I'm gonna actually bring the light higher. Okay, and here's another thing. We can see the shadow on the floor, but we cannot see it on the house. Why? Because we didn't apply this live shadow effect on the house, so we have to do that as well. I'm going to take it, apply it to the building, and again use append. Now as you see, now we have the shadow on both the floor and the house. Okay, again I'm going to use my light, go somewhere here. Okay, perfect. Now I'm gonna jump into my camera again to see how everything looks. Okay, so perfect. We have a character, nice depth of field, a floor, sky, and a nice shadow. Everything looks great. Imagine that you're happy with your scene and you want to render this out to a movie file. So what you need to do for that is go to File, Render, and here we're gonna choose the output format as .mov. Okay, please do not use AVI because of two reasons. One, it produces a very big file sizes, and two, it's not compatible with Mac computers, which we mainly use here in this department. So I'm gonna use MOV, and I'm gonna select where I want this file to be rendered to. So I'm gonna put it on desktop in this case. So I'm gonna call it scene 1, for example. Click save. So here you have to select the frame range. So I'm gonna select my start time as frame 0 and stop time, it says here 120. So let's do 120 there. And step time, let's keep that 0. Okay. And once you do that, you can check your statistics section here, and it says that total frames to render is 121 frames, which is what we want. And in this case, we don't have any audio, so there is no need to enable it here. Okay, so everything else looks pretty good to me, and I'm gonna click on render. But before doing that, please make sure you have QuickTime installed on your computer. If not, please go ahead and download Apple's QuickTime, which is free to download, and have it installed on your system, and then click on render. If QuickTime is not installed on your system, what you can do is go to output format and select JPEG, and what this will allow us to do is to create a JPEG sequence, which again you can use it as a movie file in your nonlinear editing programs like Adobe Premiere or Apple's Final Cut Pro. So in this case, I'm going to use the JPEG sequence. I'm going to click on the output file location. And don't forget, if you want to render as JPEG sequence, it's always a good idea to create a folder which will include all the JPEG files for that scene. So I'm going to come to my desktop again in my case, and create a new folder. I'm gonna call it scene 1 and click open, and I'm gonna double click here, there. Now everything is ready, so I'm gonna click on render. Now depending on your settings, it might take a while. So in this case I'm gonna use the quality as high but not maximum, just to save some time and space. Okay, and now it's rendering the whole scene, which is about 121 frames. Again, it might take a while, and as you see, I get the message that says the scene is rendered successfully. Okay, then what I can do is I can go to my video editing software and use, where is my scene? There we go. You can use, and these are all the frames that was rendered out. So you can use these so my file is so my scene is rendered into this folder. Okay, so you can see all the individual frames, and again you can take this into your non-linear editing software, and you can treat it as a movie file, and you can edit all of your scenes in that software. So this is pretty much how you can put everything together to create a nice scene. And once you render out individual scenes and put them together in Adobe Premiere or Final Cut Pro, you can create a nice animated movie.